Hi, my name is Lena, and today I'm going to be presenting to you the topic of Tanuki, or more specifically, Bake-danuki, which are a Japanese yokai. To begin, we're going to start with naming conventions because this particular topic has a pretty confusing set of names and terms to go along with it. As you can see on the top of the slide here, I've got a set of names. We have Tanuki, raccoon dog, badger, mujina, mami, Bake-danuki, mameda. And you may be wondering, that's a lot of names. And I assure you it is. I'm going to try to break this down to you nice and simply. So, to start, the first mention of a Tanuki yokai or a Tanuki demon was in the Nihon Shoki in around 720 CE, where it was referred to as Mujina. Now, Mujina most often refers to the Japanese badger or anaguma, as you can see on the slide here. Confusingly, Mujina is also the local name in many regions for tanuki, or raccoon dog, also shown on the slide here. Now, to add to the confusion, there are legends about yokai Mujina and yokai tanuki. So, a demon anaguma or a demon Japanese badger and a demon tanuki. Now, these stories usually tend to follow similar patterns and are almost identical. And so usually these stories are conflated as being about one being. To make matters even more confusing, in many translations, tanuki or Bake-danuki, we'll come back to that, is translated as badger. Now, this is confusing because badger should be referring to the anaguma or the Japanese badger or mujina, and raccoon dog would be more accurate in describing the tanuki. While the abundance of names here is disorienting, I'll be referring to the real life animal as tanuki, the raccoon dog, and the yokai as Bake-danuki, its more formal title. Although in most literature you're going to come across, the yokai is still going to be referred to as tanuki. Now that we've differentiated between the different names and the different animals and the different yokai all these names go with, let's talk a little bit about just the animal, tanuki. Now, tanuki are very resourceful animals, much like their Bake-danuki counterparts. And while tanuki are forest animals, mainly, they tend to occupy urban centers. In fact, in 2008, there were over 1,000 tanuki living in central Tokyo, which, if you're not familiar, is a city, to be sure. Now, tanuki are often referred to as raccoon dogs, as mentioned previously, and they really live up to that title, as they'll scavenge and eat just about anything, much like the raccoons you're going to find here or anywhere else. Additionally, tanuki are very adept at playing dead, somewhat like possums, and they've been known to lay prone for about 30 minutes with eyes open and glazed in a dead-like stare. They can keep this up even when, for example, they're shaken in the mouths of a predator or are being kicked by hunters. Now, the process of becoming a yokai is something we've talked about in class before. I believe we briefly talked about tsukumogami, where inanimate objects become yokai after having existed for 100 years. In the same fashion, animals who've reached the suspicious 100 years of age also become yokai, such as in the case of a tanuki becoming a Bake-danuki. As we've seen, tanuki, the animal, are resourceful and are adept at trickery, such as playing dead, and so it's no wonder that their yokai counterparts would also be known as tricksters. However, Bake-danuki do a fair bit more trickery than just playing dead. In fact, Bake-danuki folklore falls into three main categories. The first, vengeful. Now, these are stories where Bake-danuki comes seeking revenge for some slight against them, a relative, or their habitat. For example, if their forest is being destroyed. The second type of story are the grateful and benevolent Bake-danuki. Now, this is where a Bake-danuki seeks to repay a kindness of some kind, and is the exact opposite of the vengeful tales. The third and final category are trickster stories, or rogue trickster stories, where the Bake-danuki plays some sort of practical joke that range from harmless to tragic. Now, Bake-danuki tricks could easily turn deadly, but whatever the outcome, the Bake-danuki still seem to rather enjoy it. The foremost theme in Bake-danuki tales is that they're mischievous tricksters and shapeshifters, and so regardless of the aforementioned categories, there's usually some element of trickery and shapeshifting involved. While their trickster brethren, the kitsune or fox yokai, are portrayed as malicious and calculating, Bake-danuki are often portrayed more as clumsy and bumbling, and in many tales, they're drunk on sake. Older Bake-danuki stories tend to lean towards the vengeful or rogue Bake-danuki categories. However, in more recent folklore, beginning at around the Edo period, Bake-danuki tales became more lighthearted, and they began to be seen as comical figures. It's also of note that in many tales, the Bake-danuki would take the form of a large monk, sometimes drunk on sake and/or drumming their stomachs or a wooden drum. These two methods were often used in their tricks. Now you may be wondering, how do Bake-danuki shapeshift? Well, the answer is simple. Magical scrotum. The pictures you see here are only some of my favorite woodblock prints, and I assure you, a quick Google search will turn up many, many more, and I honestly recommend it. Now, you may notice that the Bake-danuki in these images are not in another form as one might assume from the word shapeshift. Instead of changing their physical shape, they're using their scrotum in a myriad of ways not originally intended. To give the appearance of changing shape, or in the instances shown here, using them as tools. Looking at these images from right to left and top row to bottom row, the scrotum is being used as, first off, a boat. The second image here, a monster in a trick. Third, to catch birds, I think. 4, as a fishing net. 5, weights in a weightlifting competition. And 6th and lastly, as a tent. In the image here, the Bake-danuki are disguised as the 7 lucky gods. Now, I don't know what story this comes from, but the woodblock helps illustrate how the scrotum would be used in disguises rather than as a tool. In the more traditional sense of the word shapeshift, later stories and depictions of Bake-danuki have full-bodied transformations, not just the scrotum. As you may imagine, finding images of a fully transformed Bake-danuki is difficult, considering they look like whatever it is they're transformed into. So instead, I've included a picture my mom sent me of a Tanuki sake pitcher and glasses. Now that we have a base understanding of Bake-danuki, it's time to look at a popular folk tale, Bunbuku Chagama, or the Lucky Tea Kettle. There are a few versions of the story that I came across, and this is an amalgamized telling of the common threads between them. Grab a cup of tea, sit back, relax, and I'm going to tell you a story. Our story begins with a poor woodcutter saving the life of a tanuki who was being attacked by some village people. Once the villagers left, the woodcutter carried on his way, and the tanuki ran back into the bushes. On his way home, the woodcutter encounters a priest of the local temple who tells the woodcutter that he's in the market for a new kettle, and that if the woodcutter should happen upon one, to bring it to him, and he will pay handsomely. The woodcutter agrees, and continues on his way home. On his way, he finds a beautiful kettle on the side of the road. The woodcutter rejoices in their luck and takes the kettle to the temple right away. When the priest sees the beautiful kettle, he exclaims his praise and pays the woodcutter as promised. Later that night, the priest places the kettle over the fire, intending to prepare himself some tea. Suddenly, the kettle sprouted 4 legs, a head, and a tail, and the kettle's surface became covered with fur. The Bake-danuki, now revealed, yelped in pain and began to run around the temple looking for an escape. Unluckily, the Bake-danuki is caught by some temple acolytes and returns to his kettle form. The priest brings the kettle back to the woodcutter's hut, demanding he be repaid for the trickster kettle. Shocked, the woodcutter returns the money. The woodcutter, mourning his lost profits, places the normal-seeming kettle on a shelf and goes to sleep. Suddenly, he's awoken by a voice. Opening his eyes, he sees the tanuki whom he had saved earlier that day. The tanuki, who is in fact a Bake-danuki, confides in the woodcutter, saying that they had tried to do the woodcutter a good turn, as they had overheard his conversation with the priest. The Bake-danuki promises to serve the woodcutter in whatever way they can, in thanks for his kindness. As it turns out, the woodcutter had just the idea in mind, which turned out to be having the Bake-danuki be an acrobat and entertainer in a traveling roadshow. In the end, the Bake-danuki helped the woodcutter become rich and famous, even being given the chance to entertain nobility on several occasions. All in all, a happy ending. This folktale is a good example of a Bake-danuki story. A little bit of trickery, a little bit of shape-shifting, and it follows the grateful and benevolent genre previously mentioned. Turning now to more recent adaptations of Bake-danuki, let's examine the popular figures shown here. Bake-danuki today, particularly these statues, represent good luck and good fortune in many realms of life, though particularly financial luck. If you have been to Japan, you may be familiar with these fellas, as they're around just about everywhere, in front of businesses, in homes, and in gardens. These pictures here show an array of Bake-danuki statues, all of which were found in Kyoto. When I began this presentation, I asked my mother, who lives in Japan, to take photos of any Bake-danuki figures she saw and thought were cute. It just so happens that she was visiting Kyoto last weekend and came across all these lovely fellows. Now, all these pictures were taken over the weekend and aren't even all the ones that she saw. So hopefully this gives you an idea of just how popular these statues are. There are 8 different traits common to these figures that each represents a different attribute. The first is a hat, which is a symbol of protection against trouble and bad weather. The second are big eyes, to be aware of surroundings and help make good decisions. The third is a sake bottle, which represents virtue for some reason. 4 is a large tail, which you can't really see here, but it's a symbol of stability and strength to achieve success. Number 5 is the prominent scrotum, which we've talked about before. The scrotum in this context is a symbol of financial luck. Just as the Bake-danuki could spread its scrotum very, very far, so too is it supposed to represent being able to spread your money. Number 6 is a note, which represents trust and confidence. Number 7 is a big belly, which is a symbol of bold and calm decisiveness. However, there's a secondary meaning to the larger stomach as well. In Japan, as in many countries, in the past, having a larger stomach or being larger was representative of luxury and wealth, as you would only be able to achieve such a form if you had the means to do so. So again, here this large stomach is also a representative of financial success. Last but not least, number 8 is a big friendly smile. I mean, just look at that smile. Wrapping up here, we're just going to briefly look at the Bake-danuki or Tanuki in pop culture. More specifically in anime and video games, though Tanuki or Bake-danuki have also become a mascot of sorts, even being on some Japanese credit cards. The first image on the left here is from Mario 3D, and it's of a Tanuki suit. Now, Tanuki here is spelled Tanooki, which may be an anglicized version of Tanuki, or it may just be Nintendo's version of it. The second image here is of a character from the anime Inuyasha, which is a Bake-danuki. And you can see that there's a little leaf on their head there. Now, in some Bake-danuki tales, it's a leaf that actually helps them transform and not their scrotum, which is certainly a friendlier thing to air on a child's television show. The third image here is a still from Pompoko, a Ghibli movie. And now Pompoko is about Tanuki and Bake-danuki in the context of environmentalism and urban development. I haven't seen it myself, but if you're interested in the topic of Bake-danuki, I would highly suggest it. The last image here is of Tom Nook from the video game Animal Crossing. You may or may not be familiar. Now, Tom Nook's character in the Animal Crossing series is often conflated with being a symbol of capitalism, as they're the one who's in charge of the money and rent and stuff like that. This is an interesting tie-in with the Bake-danuki figurines and statues and their symbol of being attached to finances. We've reached the end here of my presentation. I want to thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you learned something new today. Hopefully you enjoyed having a little storytelling session. Hopefully you had a few laughs. And I'm just going to leave you off here with this little comic. Again, this is Tom Nook from Animal Crossing. And in the little corner there is myself with my Bake-danuki figure, which I bought a few years ago when I was in Japan. Thank you again.